Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm John Howard from Insight. As I look around the room, I see and recognise a few people who were at the event this morning, the Electric Fly launch. And I guess this morning there was a great deal of consensus around debate around the need for expansion and economic growth arguments. And I hope this afternoon we can perhaps develop that debate a bit further and think about some of the specific options that are on the table around expansion of our airports. Now, today, this afternoon, we're joined by airlines, by airports, by trade associations, media, politicians, advisors. So if you like, we're joining up the dots, and while I hope that we have the same consensus that we had this morning, I feel that there will be a bit more debate and discussion around some of the specific options. But what was behind our thinking was, as the July deadline for submissions passed, we wanted to pull together some of the key top line in terms of the submissions that went into the Davies Commission, and look maybe at some of the merits of the proposals, which is why that infographic was developed with some of the options. And what today's debate will enable us to do will be to look at those options in a bit of detail, talk them through, and in advance of the interim report, understand some of those a bit better. So I'm very grateful to the panel that joined us today. So Nigel Milton is Director of Communications and Political Relations at Heathrow. Tim Hawkins, Director of Corporate Affairs from Manchester Airports Group. Kwasi Kwarteng, who is a member of the Free Enterprise and Chair of the Free Enterprise Group, was on the Transport Committee and obviously represents Spelthorne constituency adjacent to Heathrow. And Captain Moylan, who is the Aviation Advisor to the Mayor of London. So, unfortunately, James Coleman has had to drop out, but I'm sure there'll be many of you who have also got your point of view around some of the options and other options that you'll be able to share from the floor. In terms of housekeeping, we will finish by 6:30. You can tweet as per the hashtag in your books from hashtag Aviation. And obviously this is not a chat mouse event. We're all very well versed in each other's point of views. In fact, it's being recorded at the back of the room there. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask Nigel to kick off the proceedings and maybe talk for around 5 minutes about, from his point of view, around the proposal that we're going to take. Thanks, John.
Good evening, everybody. It's good to speak to you and to see so many familiar faces. So I think that some of the issues that I may have talked about, I think we'll skip over. I think we've heard probably far too many times before. But when I introduce myself to new people, so not to the people in this audience, but to people new people, and say I'm the Director for Political Affairs at Heathrow, people, it's a bit like when the plumber comes around to look at your sink and stuff, and a sharp intake of breath. That's got to be a tough job. But actually, it is a tough job. But I don't think actually that because it's Heathrow, it's actually any tougher than those of you representing other airports, and Tim, Daniel, Sarah, those of you representing other airports. Because I think that whatever, when it comes to airport expansion, whatever the option, there aren't any easy options. And if there were easy options, then we wouldn't be going through this process now, because the decisions would have been taken decades ago when perhaps it really should have been taken. But the person, or the people with the tougher job than those of us who are articulating for each of our particular options is Sir Howard Davies and his commissioners. Because they've got to sort out the claims and the counterclaims that we're making. They've got to sift the myths from the facts. They've got to sort out this will definitely happen from we're following wind, we really hope that this is how things are going to end up. And then above them, in terms of toughness of job, the person with even the tougher job is we don't know who they are yet. That's going to be the person who is sitting in Greenwich House in the summer or autumn of 2015, who's actually going to get Davies' recommendation. And given the intense public and media scrutiny there's going to be about that decision, given the undeniable importance of getting that decision right, given the inevitable opposition within their party and between parties, no matter what that decision says, to actually take a decision, to take that tough decision, that's probably the toughest job of the lot. So what I want to talk a bit about is how can we make that job slightly easier and make it, because I think what everyone in this room, looking around, what everyone in this room is agreed on is that there needs to be a decision needs to be taken. I don't think we've got anyone in the room here who thinks that this isn't an issue that needs to be grasped and that something needs to happen. So how do we, as the industry, as those who support the industry, make that decision for that person in 2015 a bit easier? So I think we have to engage in a high level of debate, and thank you to John and to Insight Policy for setting up events like today so that we can start putting across and articulating what our main arguments are and countering those of others. Because the Davies Commission, and this is why I'm so very supportive of the process, is because they have put emphasis quite correctly on analysis and evidence, not on assumption and hyperbole. And that means that there is confidence in the process. And I'm optimistic, and I hope that you all are as well, that while there may not be universal support for the recommendation that comes up, because ultimately he's going to have to pick one from a whole raft, but hopefully there will be universal support for the process and the validity of that process. So what will we be arguing in 2014 as Heathrow? Well, we're assuming that we will be shortlisted, because if we're not, then we will be arguing a lot, but assuming we are shortlisted, we will be building next year on the key arguments that we've been making over the last couple of years, and providing more detail and more evidence to support the claims we've made. So what are those key arguments? Well, firstly, that the UK needs a hub airport on a single site to provide the connectivity to enable the country to compete effectively. That's the core of what Heathrow is saying, that there needs to be a single site, a single hub. Where we differ from others who also argue that core point is that our view is that single site is best located in West London. And we'll be emphasising and providing further evidence of why that's the case. We'll also be talking a lot more about how the third runway can be built while reducing the number of people impacted by noise. Noise remains Heathrow's Achilles heel, and we will be doing more. We've already done a lot on that this year, but we'll be doing more next year on explaining how Heathrow can get bigger yet get quieter. We'll be talking a lot more about how third runway Heathrow can be built while meeting the legislative targets on air quality and carbon. And we'll also be talking about how third runway can be built without tens of billions of pounds of public money and devastating the economy of West London. So those are all difficult claims, difficult things to prove and evidence, but we will back them up with evidence and analysis. Because if we don't, then I think that if we have that confidence in the Davies process, then he won't recommend a third runway Heathrow at the end. So the impetus will be on us to prove that we can deliver against those. It's often claimed that this current process is merely a repeat of what we've seen before, which is the third or fourth time of going through. And while that's generally true in terms of the overall process, I think there are some differences this time, and some of those have been forced into good. I think the breakup of BAA has meant that the debate is that much more developed, that much higher. We've got rival ideas on different sites. We've even got rival ideas on the same site. What that means is that Davies is there getting a full range of different options to look at. We really are going to explore all of the possibilities to come up with which one is the best one. And for Heathrow specifically, also what we've seen that's different this time around is a real growing realisation in West London, in the Thames Valley, about the importance of Heathrow. And that's not just amongst local businesses, where I think in the past we've had support, but also amongst local people. And of course, we will do more, we will need to do more on noise and ensuring that those who are affected by Heathrow expansion are treated fairly. And Heathrow already has a national and international support for expansion. What we've missed, and what I think we'll start to see next year, is it will be a significant new dimension debate, which will be local support for Heathrow. It won't be overwhelming, but it will be sufficient, I believe, to rebalance the arguments about the role that Heathrow plays for West London. And I think if we as Heathrow can rebalance that argument in West London, then I'm confident that in 2015, when that as yet unknown politician is faced with this tough decision, that it won't be impossible for that politician to reach the decision to back Heathrow expansion. Thank you for listening.
Well, I'm Tim Hawkins from the Manchester Airports Group, and I think we come at this from a slightly different perspective to others in this debate. And certainly looking at the infographic, for us, there's a big element missing, which is what we do over the next 10 to 15 years before a new runway can be brought into operation. Over that sort of 10 to 15 year period, we think it's absolutely critical that we use to the best effect what we've already got, and that we drive connectivity and choice for the benefit of consumers. And that's about making the best use of the capacity we have. And as Stan said, to be blunt, we have plenty of spare capacity. The airport is fairly half full. The runway is busy at times, but across the year we have sacks of spare capacity. And that spare capacity, I think, can be used to drive competition to great effect. Nigel alluded to the separation of BAA, and we think that separation and the competition that it will develop will be a key driver of the process. So over the next 10 to 15 years, as separate owners come to this question, they will have a big impact on the use of spare capacity. So MAG acquired Stansted in February this year and was extremely confident about the potential of the airport. It saw it having a massive untapped potential. It has a very strong catchment, it has a very good infrastructure, and it has good businesses supporting it. And that confidence is starting to pay off. We have already signed a range of long-term agreements with our key customers, covering over 90% of our traffic base. So EasyJet and Ryanair have both signed up to long-term deals over the next 5 to 10 years, which will see them grow and potentially double the traffic volumes at the airport. We're also investing in the terminal and improving the quality of service, which we think will bring a greater attraction to the airport. So we know over 30 million passengers from our catchment, what we would consider to be our catchment, drive past our front door and use other London airports. We think with better service and a more competitive offer, we'll see that traffic return to Stansted. We're also very keen to support economic growth in the London, Stansted and Cambridge corridor, and support the economic growth and population shift to the east of London, and we think Stansted is very well placed to do that. But try as MAG will, over the next 10 to 15 years, to drive the use of Stansted, we think, and we've highlighted to the Commission and we've talking to Government about the steps that we think can be made in that period to make the most effective use of capacity. In particular, we've been working with London First and with Network Rail and TfL to look at investment in the rail corridor up to Stansted. Currently takes anywhere between 47 and 59 minutes to get to Stansted. The reliability and robustness of that service is not great. With relatively modest investment in the line, we think we can cut journey times and improve the reliability significantly. That won't just benefit the airport, it will benefit commuters and will support the economic development of North and East London. And we think with that investment to bring the journey times down below 40 minutes would double the number of people who live within an hour's train journey of Stansted, and we think that is an important step forward to take in attracting people and bringing Stansted that bit closer to London. We also think there's something very entrepreneurial the government can do with APD, really to support and mimic what airports do when they're trying to grow traffic, which is to offer long-term frameworks of discounts to airlines to start new services and to grow their business. And we think if the government is interested in growing connectivity for the UK, then supporting that with an approach to APD that recognises that and tries to incentivise new services would grow connectivity and have great benefit in driving choice for consumers. But in terms of competition, we think it's very important that the Davies Commission process does not suffocate the structure of London airports that we've now created through the Competition Commission process. Competition will have a huge driving force in the process of delivering new capacity. It was the main reason why BAA was broken up. The Competition Commission believed that in central ownership you would get more innovation in the design, in the policy development, and in the construction and the delivery of new capacity. And I think that's got to be right. I think we're in a better place now than we were before. And each of the schemes that people talk about will have their own competitive advantages. we would consider the Stansted option to have advantages in terms of cost, in terms of its deliverability, in terms of its environmental impact. And it's not all about a hub, despite really most of the debate being taken up with that issue. It's not even mostly about a hub, actually, when you look at the traffic forecasts. Look at the traffic forecasts, and more than 2/3 of the growth over the next 30 years is expected to be in short-haul traffic. Over 2/3 of the growth is expected to be in leisure traffic. Passengers that use short-haul leisure services want cost-effective airport capacity. They don't need and they don't want the expense of a hub, all the connectivity and all the infrastructure cost that goes with that. They want access to cost-effective, cheap, simple airport capacity. And because a significant amount of growth over the next 30 years is going to be that, it would make, I think, poor economic sense to only deliver a hub and only deliver that capacity at low expense. So, coming from Stansted's perspective, we think there are some very strong attributes of a Stansted proposal. Stansted can either be and provide capacity as a 2-runway airport or as a 4-runway airport, and we await the Commission's shortlist to see how we can take it
forward. Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. My name is Kwasi Kwarteng. I'm the Conservative Member of Parliament for Spelthorne, and I'm also responsible and the chair of the Free Enterprise Group. So, because of my constituency interest, and also because of my interest in the economy and free enterprise, this is an issue which I'm very passionate about, and feel that we actually could do a bit more in promoting. I spent 3 years on the Transport Select Committee, and of course aviation capacity was an issue that we had an investigation into. It was something that members of the committee were particularly interested in. And I think one of the earlier speakers suggested that we've rehearsed a lot of these debates for a number of years now. And I certainly felt that after 3 years on the Transport Committee. I think we have heard lots of the arguments. And frankly, without a decision, we're going to hear these arguments for another 20 years. There's no end to arguments about aviation capacity. And I've said publicly that discussing aviation is rather like theology. It's an open-ended discussion. There's no reason why the debate should end at any point. And unless a decision is taken, I think we will continue having these debates, and we'll continue having panel discussions like this for a good many years to come. Now, where we are in terms of the time frame, it seems to me that we're really, in a sense, we're in a kind of pool between two waterfalls, because this is a hiatus. We know that there'll be a decision from the Davies Commission with one final decision, if you like, after the election. We know that. Before it was set up, we didn't know when the decision would take place. So we know now that it'll be in probably 2 years' time, at least. And in a sense, this sort of forum in this 2-year period is really rather academic, because we don't know what Davies is going to come up with. We know, I think next month, he's supposed to be coming up with an interim report. But the interim report will only have, I think, will have 3 options. And effectively, in terms of debate, there have only ever been really 3 or possibly 4 options anyway. So it'll be interesting to see if Davies actually eliminates any of the widely touted options. We have to wait and see that. And then, of course, once we've got the 3 options, there'll be more time that will elapse before he comes up with his final verdict, if you like. And I suspect, given what I know of Davies and what I know of this sort of process, the final verdict won't be as definitive as you or I might be led to believe. I think it'll probably be, it could well be quite open-ended, in which case we'll be roughly no further on than where we were at the beginning. That's a possibility. I'm not saying that he won't actually come up with an answer, but we know how some of these things could work out. Now, my own view, I've always been in favour of the Heathrow expansion, but I think that in many ways Heathrow expansion, and Nigel doesn't like me saying this, I think Heathrow expansion may well be, the window may well be shutting on that, because it's a debate that's run on for a very long time. And we have to consider that the original white paper recommending it came out in 2003, which is 10 years ago now. And as a consequence of that, the then designed, the then designated third runway, which was running through a village called Spelthorne, was touted. If you go to Heathrow, you'll see a strip where the third runway could be. If you go to the village where the third runway was, which was going to be affected by it, a lot of the people who lived in that village have sold their houses to Heathrow, and the character of that community has changed. Now, my particular objection to this was that not that the third runway was going to be built there, but having, as it were, sort of cast a shadow over this community. It looks like we're not going to get the third runway anyway. So we've got, from the community point of view, we've gone through the blight, if you like, of having this sort of shadow of the third runway there, without actually getting the benefit of the third runway. And what I've said very categorically to Heathrow is that I don't think it's right for other communities to go through with this. I don't think it's right for them to say, oh, well, we're going to build a third runway here, and then have another 10-year debate, and then not actually build the runway. I don't think that's fair on the people who live there. And I think because of this hiatus, if you like, a number of new ideas have come to the fore. I mean, I'm disappointed to see that Gatwick representative isn't here, because that's an option that's been put out there, if you like, really only in the last year. I certainly have been following the debate for 3 years, and Gatwick came really from sort of left field as the second line. It was always in the background, but it's never really been a front runner until quite recently. And what we've had in the debate, if you were to go back 2 years, we had, when Boris first came up with the Boris Island, that was an innovative, bold plan, which you'll hear more about from Daniel. We obviously had the third runway option. And then there was a possible, people did moot a Stansted expansion option. Of those three, I've always favoured Heathrow expansion. But I'm not sure, given the nature of the length of the debate, whether that is in fact what's going to happen. What I'd like to happen, or what I think will happen, may well be two different things in this particular instance. I suspect we'll come up with a compromise. I suspect Davies will come up with a compromise, which will not please, probably won't please anyone, but it'll be the least bad option. And that's the nature of our political, our political culture. I was struck actually, last thing I'd say, I was struck by speaking to German politicians about this, with respect to Frankfurt. And those of you who know Frankfurt will know they've got 4 runways now. And you'll also know, if you know a bit about the history, that the third runway in Frankfurt Airport was probably more controversial than the third runway at Heathrow. It was, in fact, the German army had to physically remove demonstrators when they built it. And this was a country in the 1980s where the Green Party regularly got 9–10% of the vote. So it was a big political issue. And I asked one of these German politicians, I said, so how did you manage to build the third runway? And then 25 years later, you built a 4th one. And he said very clearly that what happened was that it was the policy was driven at a local level by the city of Frankfurt, politicians of the city of Frankfurt, and the Hessische Land, the land of Hesse, because the federal system is one of the counties, if you like, the Länder of Germany. And it was very much agreed on a bipartisan basis between the SPD and the CDU, the two principal parties in that political system. And they said, we were very clear, we wanted Frankfurt to be a hub. We wanted Frankfurt to be the European hub. And it wasn't a matter of accident that happened. It didn't just somehow evolve by the sort of invisible hand. It was an act of political will that they decided that this was going to be their hub. And that's what effectively they've done. And in terms of protests, there are still, and I was told, there are still people every Monday morning who are protesting about the 4th runway, even though it was built 4 years ago. And they come in, and the man at the Frankfurt Airport said, well, we wave to them, we give them a coffee, they sit there for an hour, and then they go. And then we get on with, our business. And I think that, with the right political will, I think people can do things that are seemingly quite controversial. And I think that the Frankfurt Airport was a classic case in which political cooperation sort of overcame, if you like, a lot of a considerable amount of opposition. And Frankfurt is a fairly successful airport now. I mean, certainly when I went to Kurdistan, I flew through Frankfurt. That was where I changed. So I think with the right, if Davies comes up with an answer, I think it'll be beholden to politicians to have the courage to follow through on what his findings are. And I think once we've actually gone through with this and stuck to a plan, I think the future is quite bright. Very last of all, I'd say that it's interesting that the debate has moved on in the sense that no one is suggesting, very few people are suggesting, that we don't have a problem. Very few people now, 3 years ago it was slightly different. 3 years ago you heard the argument that HS2 would somehow obviate the need for any airport expansion. But you don't hear that much these days. And you certainly don't, and certainly I think in the House of Commons, barring probably Caroline Lucas and maybe a handful of Liberal Democrats, I think there's a broad consensus in the House of Commons amongst our political parties that there needs to be some additional aviation capacity. So I think the debate has moved on, but we're still waiting for the final answer, if you like. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I'll come down there if I may, since I don't seem to have any notes. I'm glad, I'm very happy that I worked with somebody who's actually been making this argument now for 5 years, since before we came there. And I think a great deal of the movement that we see at the moment, the progress in this debate, is actually due to the efforts that Boris has put in. And I think we should give him credit for that, because 5 years ago nobody was saying we needed new runways and that aviation is important. We closed the subject down. We closed it down completely in 2010 and said no new runways anywhere. And that's the end of the story, and nobody will bother us about that again. But Boris has kept that all going, and I think he was the one actually flying that flag. And then Heathrow certainly acknowledge the role that he played, and many business organisations do, in putting that forward, which means it's disappointing, but actually not that many business organisations and businesses who are willing to put their head above the parapet in favour of his solution. Now, I'm not going to dwell in front of this audience too much on the details of the argument for that. I'd rather spend a few minutes speculating about what I think might happen with Davies. I think the Davies Christmas report could, of course, be entirely a damp squib. It could, as Kwasi indicated, simply leave on the table all of the options that were on the table a year ago. But plain progress, because it would have gone from 50 individual proposals it received, some of which were totally batty, down to the 5 proposals we knew we'd started with. And then you say, that's marvellous, we've achieved progress. We got back to where we were a year ago when all sensible people knew there were 4 or 5 possible answers. That's progress. That's possible. But I think it's possible also that they will actually lose some realistic options. I think the option that is most at risk, being frank, is a new airport in the estuary. I think it is, if something is going to be ruled out, I think Davies is likely to rule that out rather than anything else. I think it's possible they might leave Stansted on the table. You know that the Mayor supports a 4-runway airport at Stansted. They will leave that on the table as a sort of side to the argument that you should move Heathrow somewhere else. Now, Tim here from Stansted has expressed the huge enthusiasm that the owners of Stansted have for that project. He managed to get in to his penultimate sentence under his breath, the idea that Stansted might be a 4-runway airport. So I think leaving that on the table is almost intentionally designed to set up a straw man, because unless MAG and its funders embrace it wholeheartedly and enthusiastically, it will never get legs, it will never really get traction in the Davies process. And it's clear that what Stansted really want is a new railway, which Boris is happy to support anyway for other reasons. The local reasons that Tim mentioned are absolutely valid, and there should be a better railway to Stansted. We're already supported that as a short-term measure, but also for local London transport reasons. They want that, and they don't really want a second runway. I think they'd like permission to have a second runway at some distance in the future, but as we all know, as Tim said, they aren't even half full on the existing runway. So there is no imperative urgency about a second runway at Stansted. It's not actually part of any short-term solution to anything, because nobody's proposing to build it in the short term. It might one day come into its own. And then they would like to improve the retail and cut some deals with a couple more airlines and possibly get one of their customers in Manchester to come and start doing some flights into a different hub. It will be a Middle Eastern hub or something like that, to start to give Stansted back the feel of being a proper airport, which it hasn't had now for a very long time. But they're not genuinely very interested in a 4-runway hub airport. So that will leave 2 options effectively on the table, and they're different not just in location, but in character. One will be an expansion of Heathrow. And I think we all ought to be clear, I don't think we'd all agree on this. This decision, if a decision is made at all, will be a decision for the next 50 or 60 years. It will be a multi-generational decision. And so if there is a decision to expand Heathrow, it will be a decision to have a 4-runway airport at Heathrow. It won't be 4 runways a day, 3 runways and 4 runways, but that will be it. There won't be a further debate beyond that over the next 50 years. So that is one option that will be on the table. And the other will be a Gatwick type solution. Now it's important to note that the Gatwick solution is not different. Gatwick is not merely a different place. It is a wholly different approach to the needs of the country. The Gatwick solution can be summarised as 2 + 2 + 2. I'm sorry the man from Gatwick isn't here, because I'm going to be a bit ruder about his case than anything I've said about, or intend to say, particularly about Heathrow, with whom we actually have a lot in common. The 2 + 2 + 2 3-part solution has, the first part is Heathrow should have 2 runways. That translated, that means for God's sake don't give Heathrow a 3rd runway, because it would wreck Gatwick and damage our shareholders. The second 2 is give us Gatwick a 2nd runway. And then the 3rd part is, well, there really is no 3rd part, because the 3rd part is just there for symmetry. It's give Stansted a 2nd runway, but we've already said Stansted hardly needs a 2nd runway, certainly for the foreseeable future. So the whole Gatwick plan comes down to saying, don't expand Heathrow, whatever you do, but give us a 2nd runway. And that can sort us for the next 15 years, 20 years. It'll sort Gatwick for the next 15 or 20 years at least. But it is completely negating the argument in favour of a hub airport as being the most efficient way of achieving the maximum connectivity, something which Nigel can explain to you even more eloquently than I can, and something that we agree with Heathrow very much about. Now, I think that if that is the outcome of Christmas, it changes the dynamic of the next phase enormously. And here we have to understand, and please tell me if I'm going on too long, because I lose track of time when I'm talking. I could talk for hours and I still wouldn't be 10 minutes long.
No, we won't let you do that.
Don't hesitate, stop me. Here it's very important to understand that we talk, all of us, as if Davis were the determinative process in all of this. And that all we have to do is get an answer out of Davis, and then the politicians decide, work up the courage to deliver it, and then it happens. But actually the determinative process in a huge capital project is finance. And we need to look at what the owners, there are only 3 large groups that invest in airports, that own airports in Britain. There are 3 large groups. We actually have to look at what the owners are saying about what they are going to finance. And actually, there is no expression of support on the part of Heathrow's shareholders for Heathrow expansion, and no indication whatsoever of a willingness to finance it, and certainly on behalf of Ferrovial, the lead shareholder, even though they're now only 25%, they're still a large shareholder. I think if you said to Rafael Del Pino, would you like to put, 25 pence more money into British aviation, he wouldn't spit in your eye, but you'd feel like it. He was a proud and courteous Spanish gentleman. But nonetheless, that's exactly what he would feel like doing. So I don't think, we've got the finance lined up for all of this. What we have is a powerful set of interests. And I think the change, there'll be a big change in the dynamic based on that. Because, and this is the controversial thing I'm going to say, if Davies pans out in the way I described, so the choice is effectively between a 4-runway hub at Heathrow and no hub at all. And remember, parenthesis please, 1 second, although Nigel and I are absolutely convinced of the hub argument, and it may be the case that others on panel are as well, we have not won that argument, and we have not won it with Davies. And the Gatwick proposal has far more traction than I ever thought it would get, and it worries Nigel much more than it worries me. Because if you end up with those 3 proposals, I'm coming back now to where I was, on the table at Christmas, it means that Gatwick has won. It means that Davies will take account of 2 things, the national interest and political deliverability. And he, in the end, will be driven by what he believes to be deliverable. He does not want his report to sit in a drawer for the next 30 years, and Davies will have failed. And I'm quite convinced that he will go for the option that he thinks he can sell to the Labour Party, to the Conservatives, but more to the Labour Party, possibly to those elements of the, and there are elements of the Liberal Democrats, by the way, who do believe in aviation and do believe in aviation expansion. They're probably a minority and they remain fairly quiet, but there are certainly members of the Liberal Democrats in leading positions who do understand this argument. And I think he will go for the option that he thinks he can sell to them. And that option will be a 2nd runway at Gatwick. He might say, you could also have a 3rd runway at Heathrow, but that, of course, he will have recognised is an impossible combination. Because if you offer it to both of them, Gatwick can't build a 2nd runway. So that effectively collapses into choosing a 3rd runway at Heathrow. So I don't think he will put that as part of his choice in the end. I think it will be Gatwick and solely Gatwick. Now, I think understanding that post-Christmas, if I'm right, and I may not be right, I'm not claiming any special insight, I'm just here as rumours and things, but if I'm right about Christmas, the estuary is off the table, I think the dynamic effect on the whole debate is going to be very, very significant. Because I think Heathrow, which is very worried about Gatwick, will be really, really worried about the Gatwick solution from that point on. And that, I think, will change their dynamic very strongly and in very interesting ways. And that's about all really I've got to say. Anybody who'd like me to now explain why Boris thinks we need a hub airport, we need a hub airport. Why it can't be at Heathrow, I'm happy to dwell on that. And why it needs to be somewhere else, I'm happy to go into
We could do that in the discussion.
I'd rather stop at that point, because I think we really need to think now what is going to happen after Christmas.
Can I ask you a question? Sorry about, you said you made a statement, the only thing I didn't follow was that if Heathrow is offered a 3rd runway and Gatwick is offered a 2nd, then you seem to think it was some sort of logical conclusion that Gatwick couldn't build a 2nd.
Yes.
But why is that?
Well, if Heathrow had a 3rd runway tomorrow, Gatwick would lose nearly all of its traffic to Heathrow tomorrow.
So they wouldn't be able to build the 2nd runway?
Gatwick has passengers, partly because it offers a certain amount of sort of point-to-point stuff, which is the sort of business that Stansted and Luton survive on, and it appeals to a sort of geographical area to the southwest of London, in the same way that they appeal to their geographical areas. But the real stuff that makes Gatwick into a serious airport, it is a serious airport, is overspill traffic in Heathrow. Now, Heathrow, of course, in its plans for the future, envisages the 3rd runway slowly filling up. This is a little bit mendacious on their part, because they know perfectly well that if they open the 3rd runway tomorrow, it will fill up within 24 hours, just because all the people from Gatwick would have booked their places to move across to it. So, and you know that's perfectly true. You know that you're going to have to deal with surface access consequences of the 3rd runway much faster than you were thinking in your written plans. You just assume normal aviation growth. So a 3rd runway at Heathrow is almost fatal to Gatwick's prospects, which is why the 2+2 plan, in the 2+2+2 plan, the really important bit is the first 2, which is, for God's sake, don't give a 3rd runway to Heathrow. Keep it at 2 runways.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. in defence of Councillor Moylan, he did say that we've got two Heathrow people on the panel, so therefore I deserve twice as long. And I think it's quite interesting that...
well, I can't keep up with the law changed complete revelation for me.
Certainly challenging people.
Changed your position since
I
then.
didn't quite take it. Politically, I think your analysis was spot on. I think we're going to end up almost by default with the second runway gap.
Thank you.
That's where I think we'll end up.
One of the things that I'm aware of is that obviously you made some points about the standards proposal at first, and obviously started that. And to summarise, I guess you're saying that we've got lots of capacity there for the next few years anyway. You don't even know what your options are. Do you want 2 or do you want 4? Can you afford it? Etc. Tim, is there anything that you want to particularly say in response to that?
I think what we're talking about is providing capacity as soon as it can be provided. We're not talking about providing it today or tomorrow, next year, or even in the next 5 years. So the traffic levels that stand today are in some ways secondary in thinking about bringing forward plans for new capacity there. I think thinking about the time frame when new capacity will be deliverable, we're very confident that we'll be at much higher levels of traffic than we are today, and that despite the way that we've planned airports in the UK in the last 50 years, probably the best way to provide airport capacity is when it's actually needed. And that might be at around the same time that we would reach capacity assets. So wouldn't it just be refreshing to provide it as it's needed rather than adopt a position where we go around and circles for a long period of time. And Daniel's right, we have adopted a pretty modest, low-key, I think evidence-based approach to submissions to the Commission and a relatively, I would say, low profile publicly. But we think that's the stage we're at in this process with the Commission. It's about being on the shortlist, and we have invited the Commission to shortlist both our proposals, but just sort of to Daniel's point about a 4 runway option, that stands, it is contingent entirely, we would say, on government support for the closure of Heathrow. That's not something we've been out there promoting, but if it's something the government wants to consider, it is something the Davies Commission wants to consider in the second phase of this work, it has to be clear that the closure of Heathrow isn't just some vague notion in principle, but in mind. It's actually got to be pretty clear that if it came to it and now showed that this was the right thing to do, it would do it. Otherwise, consideration of that kind of option at Stansted is a relatively theoretical exercise.
Is there anything more that you might do in the same way that Nigel spelled out, come next year, there's a body of work to do around local, regional, whatever, that you might be doing, perhaps at the moment you've got this, the flexible solution you've got on the table, do you think that we might see that revised, might we see more indications to, we need the government to take some of those, or we need more of those decisions to be taken? Do we see that you might be raising the head of the parapet a bit more, so that, if we gathered again, that we may not have any criticism from other people about Stansted's approach and your voice in the debate so far?
The degree of assurance, the degree of guarantee and government coordination would be probably on a level probably not seen, in the last 50 years in terms of creating a site, reusing it, redeveloping another site, creating things to it. That will require so many joined up decisions in terms of the financing of it, in terms of how do we pay for a new set of infrastructure that won't be used for 10 or 15 years, how do we connect that to London, how do we deal with issues of life, both in what's left behind and what we develop. There are so many issues to be dealt with that some of them are not now gifted to address, so we'll be looking for others as well to participate in that discussion.
Too many known unknowns in the word with I guess the other part I want to ask Nigel is that you made some points around the fact that that I think you said noise remains our Achilles heel, and I think given the fact that a quarter of the youth population are effectively most exposed to airport noise are in that Heathrow airport flight path, does that really not make Heathrow expansion impossible, or how are you going to really work around that, and how can we see some of those arguments being developed in the future?
I think it makes it challenging, and that's why I think that if in the past Heathrow's tried to pretend that noise can be solved or it can be something, or it's not really an issue. But I think that's with totally indefensible. It's quite clear that Heathrow does have significant impact upon thousands of people. I think that the EU numbers, I think, they provide context, but at the same time, they also are convenient to use. And what we saw was that, and again, I mean, it's interesting some Kwasi's comments about the time these things take and about our government. And I think that if you were starting from scratch, you wouldn't build a hub airport to the west of the city. And if that's not Heathrow's fault. We are where we are, so we've got to make use of that. But you wouldn't. And what? If you start from scratch, very hard. Well, because of where business is, you probably put it to the northwest of London now. That's where, you try and take advantage of the M4 corridor, the Thames Valley, HS2, the infrastructure's being built. There are arguments for some of the proposals that, the two proposals that Daniel's put. If your main situation is actually nobody being affected by noise, then you go for the Thames estuary. If you're looking at, I think that there is great, I can understand the attraction from in terms of shifting the geography, the economic geography of London, of looking at putting one to the east. But I think that the biggest issue that we have with a new airport to the east is just the pure cost and the dislocation. It's not just about moving Heathrow, it's about the impact that has on West London's Valley. So I think that what the French government did in the 1970s was when which was the hub airport for Paris at the time, they realised it was in the wrong place. They closed it and built Charles de Gaulle, but that was 30, 40 years ago when they had the money, the political will to do that, and they weren't playing catch up, they were to take a decision then. And 30, 40 years ago when we had the Royal School Commission others, that was probably the moment, if you were going to close Heathrow, that was the moment to do it. We now are where we are, with an economy in the state it's in, having the city having built up the way it's built up, but that is no longer, in our view, an option. So that's the other thing I want to look at is that also so the other big EU airports, yes, they are better located. But if you look at America and you look at the number of people impacted by noise at some of the biggest airports in America, Los Angeles, Miami, Chicago, JFK, those are similar numbers to Heathrow. So by European standards, yes, Heathrow is off the charts. But by global standards, and looking at it's not, it's the same kind of issues they deal with. So I think what we've seen in America, what we're going to be seeing in Heathrow is better use of airspace. The airspace routes into Heathrow haven't changed for 40 or 50 years. The technology on board aircraft is now far more sophisticated. We don't have to follow the same path in every single flight now. So we need to see, we didn't see the changes in that, and the airlines to look at that. Technology is improving. If you look at the size, even though the number of flights into Heathrow has increased over the last 20, 30 years, or it hasn't increased over the last 10 years, it has increased over the last 20, 30 years, the size of the console has decreased. Since Heathrow's been full over the last decade, we've seen the size of the console, the number of people impacted by noise being increased. I also think that the headline figure of whether you use and there's different measures you can use, the LDEN console or the LEQ console, but that measure is the number of people living in the console. It doesn't mean to say that everybody who lives within that console is impacted by noise, and there are many people who live around the airport, who live incredibly close to the airport, who don't see noise as an issue. But there are also, I accept, there are also people who live outside the console who do see noise as an issue. So there's different ways in which we need to address the issue. So I mean, airspace, technology, improved mitigation. The biggest concern I think there is in terms of noise is the early morning flights. I think there's more that we need to do, and I think with a third runway, we're not asking for more night flights, but a third runway would give us more options for different routes to be flown by those early morning flights, so that would reduce the impact that those flights have. So I think there are things that we can do to reduce the impact significantly, so that our claim is, and we will be tested on this next year, but our claim is that we can add ultimately 50% more flights that reduce the number of people impacted by noise than the level today.
Just a couple of other points. Kwasi, I think you made the point that the risk is that post-2015, when another government in office, and how long they then take to make a decision about this, there's a risk about that. Well, let's remember that this timetable that's been given to Davies has been given by the government, and if by the end of this year we're in a position where we've got 3, 4 options on the table, what's to stop us saying we want to be in a position where we go into the next election knowing clearly what the option is?
We'll know what the options are, but when we reach a conclusion.
Yeah. So I guess is there any move within Parliament?
No,
Parliament
that's not how politics works. The reason why Davies was asked to report after the election was because we wanted him to report after the election.
Yeah.
So there's no chance of us deciding what the policy will be before he gives the report.
I'm just aware that the Free Enterprise Group has been very active in saying.
We've openly said we think we should expand the flow.
Yeah.
But given where we are with the debate, what we think should happen and what we think will happen are two different things. As Daniel has suggested, Daniel would like there to be an estuary airport. What he thinks will happen is different from that. And you can have these two things in your head. What you want and what you think will happen can be different.
Sure.
And I think Daniel's political analysis is absolutely spot on, because I happen to share it. I think that given the way politics works, given where the lead actors, I mean, it's not completely unknown who will be the Prime Minister. We know it will be probably one of the two people. And given what they've said in the past, we also know that both of these politicians have been quite sceptical about Heathrow. I mean, the Conservative Party went into the election ruling out Heathrow expansion. Edmund Milton, as I understand, is the only or the most vociferous opponent of the third runway when he was in Canada. When his own government was supporting the third runway, he was against it. And so I think that given where the history of this, and there's always a context to everything, I think it's, Heathrow has a battle.
Finally, before we open up to the audience, I'm just aware, Daniel, that you went through the propositions from Stansted, Heathrow and Gatwick and made some comments, remarks and critique around those. Is there anything else you wanted to add specifically around the proposals that Boris has put on the table?
Well, only to say that Malcolm, I'm going to have to give you a quote afterwards. I know what you want to write. Okay, so can I get that in now? But only to say that one of the advantages of starting with a new site is that we have very much better product at the end. It's easier to build, and it'll be designed according to best practice. We know what best practice is because it's British engineers and British architects who are building all these airports around the world at the moment. And you will also get a lot of road and rail connectivity to the estuary or indeed to Stansted, that doesn't exist at the moment. One of the problems with Heathrow expansion, and it is not true, Nigel, please don't keep saying that it won't require billions of pounds from public purse, because simply what you have to do to the M25 in order to have two runways built over it, the road and rail access that needs to be put in to cope with the doubling in passenger numbers, because it will be a 4-runway airport at the time. There's no point putting in a bit of rail that will do it for 3 and then not making it for 4. We've estimated that as being around £20 billion. Our own surface access would be around £25 billion. And Heathrow's figures for putting in 2 new runways are really very, very large. They're basically saying that one runway would be 14 and one would be £16 billion. That's their figures. The entire economic value of the airport, the entire airport at the moment, is only about £14 billion. So they're volunteering, except that their shareholders aren't volunteering, to take on a huge financial commitment within the perimeter and then asking the public to pay for a very substantial surface access improvement outside the perimeter. I just don't think once it's looked at closely, it's going to stack up.
Right, thank you.
And at least high roads go somewhere you can't go at the moment. The new roads around Heathrow will just be a moved M25.
Okay, let's open up to the floor then. If you can introduce who you are, and if there's anything particularly who's got a point of view in terms of one of the options that's not been discussed so far, we're particularly keen to hear from you.
Malcolm, business government, thank you for the plug down. 2 very simple questions. I'm a little bit confused with the diagram up there. One question for you, and one for him. First of all, which is the one that you were promoting, or people were promoting last week, those 2 schemes? And the other one is, I'm confused a bit with Heathrow as well, with what I call the drop low concept, and what I call the waterside knocking down concept. The one that you are promoting, I thought, was to the north west of the airport, which would result in British Airways finding new headquarters, forgive me if I'm wrong. And there is the Jock Low concept, very competent gentleman. Are you in support of his scheme? Dan, can you
answer first? We won't. First of all, Boris doesn't promote airports. Boris promotes the right public policy outcome for London. That's elected to do. The people who were last week doing their stuff last week are a private group, not directly connected to the mayor, who are promoting a Boris Island outcome of their own. We have our own Boris Island concept. They have their Boris Island concept. That's fine. Just as we have a proposal on the Isle of Grain, and Foster's have a proposal on the Isle of Grain, and they're not the same. And that's also fine, because that's what Davis called for. And just as actually there's more than more runway proposal for Stansted that's been submitted as well. They're not all from MAG. So that's fine, and I'm sorry if the newspapers got the impression that was they did get muddled and they sort of said it was us promoting it. But not. What we've done is to demonstrate that if you make a decision, which we think you should, to relocate Heathrow to the east of London, there are at least 3 locations where that is feasible, financeable, and deliverable. And actually, Boris really, in a sense, doesn't mind which one gets chosen if it comes out as the right solution for London.
And then your question about Heathrow Hub. So there's a company that is totally separate to Heathrow Airport Holdings Limited, which is the company I work for, which is very conveniently called Heathrow Hub, so there's no chance of any confusion whatsoever. And they are totally separate. They are run by a guy called Mark Bostock, who used to work for Arup, Jock Lowe, and Steve Costello. They're actually owned by a company called Runway Innovations UK. The reason why I know this is because I've had to try and find it out, because there is so much confusion about whether we are promoting Heathrow Hub. We're not. It's a separate organisation. They have submitted a proposal to Davis for their solution, as indeed have other people submitted to Davis proposals for the expansion of Heathrow, which aren't linked to us. We don't, while we are supportive of the fact that they've submitted their proposals to Davis, we want Davis to look at all the options, we don't endorse the Heathrow Hub option. The main reason why we don't is because what Heathrow Hub are proposing to do is to double the length of the existing runways. And what that means is they won't be providing any respite for the communities that live underneath the runways. What happens at Heathrow at the moment is that halfway through the day the runway is being used for takeoff and landing swap over, which provides half a day free from noise for the populations living underneath those flight paths. That, under our proposals for a third runway, that respite, that alternation will continue. Under Jock Lowe's proposals, because you will just be using more intensively the 2 runways, essentially flight paths that are currently being used, there will be no respite for local people. And for that reason, while there are advantages of what Heathrow Hub are suggesting, one of the non-negotiables for us in the options we put forward to the Davis Commission was that there had to be guaranteed respite for all communities living under the flight path. And Heathrow Hub's proposal doesn't provide that. So you're right that the proposals that we have put forward, which do include the northwest option, which would require British Airways head office at Waterside to be vacated. But that's one of the 3 options we've put forward. Okay. So sorry, Christy.
No, I haven't mentioned Manchester. That wasn't to exclude it. We've talked about Manchester extensively and written about it in our submissions. And we don't think the capacity problem, we share the view with the Commission that the capacity problem can't be solved for London by trying to divert demand away from London to regional airports, but we do think there is more regional airports can do to serve demand around their own airports.
And that's something the Transport Subcommittee took evidence on.
Yes, we did, but I think from my recollection of the committee's findings, I think that's a separate issue from the
The regional airports will give best service to their local communities, including their business communities, by flying into a hub airport. And the question is whether that hub airport is going to be in Britain. Already Schiphol serves 27 UK destinations. Heathrow serves 7 or 8, depending on how you measure it, how you count Belfast. If you look at flights out of Manchester, it does support some direct flights to non-hub destinations in the United States and Pakistan, because they have a sufficient population to do that in the local area. But most of the flights are actually flying into a hub somewhere to create connectivity for the people who live in that area. That's a good and very valuable thing to do. I would rather that was into a British hub airport. And that means it needs to be an airport with sort of spare capacity that is seen in other international hub airports where they operate to a norm of maybe 80% capacity utilization, like Schiphol and Frankfurt and Paris, rather than being constantly rammed full, which is how Heathrow operates, and it may be said intends to continue operating even with the third runway, because Colin was quite explicitly saying that in public session to the Davies Commission when it took evidence. So regional flights will always be marginal as to Heathrow and vulnerable because they are marginal. It's much better for Heathrow if you're flying in somebody from Orlando to connect to that flight to Hyderabad than that you're flying in people from Liverpool or Newcastle. Liverpool, of course, has no flight to Heathrow, but Liverpool, Newcastle, and wherever. So the right regional answer for Britain is one that has a large hub airport with spare capacity where airlines are willing to take risks on marginal routes. You can't take risks at Heathrow if you're an airline, because to do so you have to give up a banker slot in which you're making money, effectively.
Okay, I want to start wrapping up because I know some panel members have to start heading off, but are there any final comments or questions that anybody's got? Okay, I'll take both of them then. Yeah.
He's something from aviation-wise. I'm just wondering about whether the connectivity argument needs to be as strong as it is for Heathrow, in that the UK, unlike a lot of its competitors, the UK hub is an end destination in its own right. It's a major point-to-point market. Other airports like Abu Dhabi, Doha, Amsterdam, they need this connecting traffic. Also, the kind of world map has changed a lot. A lot of the traffic that had to come by London, for example, from Africa and from the Middle East, flies direct now. So people go Lagos, New York direct. They go Abu Dhabi, Dubai, New York direct. And there are a lot of other examples of that because of longer range aircraft. And in a way, isn't Heathrow more of acting more as a spoke to all these other airports who've been allowed to, and countries that have been allowed to build up their own hubs on the back of Heathrow, because they've rapidly expanded. And I just wonder whether Heathrow is more of a spoke. If you discount the connectivity argument and look at that map there are 6 airports within an hour of London on that map. You haven't got London City there. You've got Cambridge. You haven't got Southend. There's Norfolk, that makes 10 runways within an hour of London. Is there an argument to say that could we not make better use of the existing runways we have, and I think you could argue that there are enough, and make better use of the capacity that has been given to carriers at Heathrow? Is that all being given to carriers in the best interests of Britain PLC, UK PLC?
Can I respond to that? I think that is going to weigh very heavily with Davies. The argument for having a major hub airport, apart from the fact that you want to stand tall with your international competitors, the argument for having it in Britain is that you will definitely get better connectivity. You will have more flights serving more destinations with higher frequencies. That is indubitably the case. But of course, if you're Davies, you sit there and say, I'll accept that. But what is the cost of getting to that? Because there's a cost. And what is the benefit? And as you rightly point out, we are not Dubai. Dubai wouldn't have any airplanes at all if it didn't have a hub airport. There hardly lives there. We are London. We have 20 to 30 million people within striking distance, and there are people, many of them, who can afford to fly. So our origin and destination market, like you can imagine him saying, is always going to be able to support a significant amount of connectivity. What is the value of the additional connectivity relative to the cost of achieving it? And that is a question he may well ask. Now, I think you can get that calculation wrong, and I think the value is still there. We've tried to demonstrate with numbers, reliable resources opposed to the young, but then who believes numbers like this? But we've tried to demonstrate with numbers the genuine uplift, not only in connectivity, but in economic activity, that you get from having a hub. But it's very easy to retreat into saying exactly what you're saying, huge origin and destination market, hub would be better, cost of disruption is however too much, so spread it around a bit.
I mean,
It's easily say that.
It's quite ironic actually, because three of us on the panel genuinely are convinced by the hub argument. And so that's a different argument, having, are we going to have a hub or are we going to have the sort of provision that you've described? I'm convinced about hub airport idea simply because that's where the world is going. I mean, when I go to Dubai or go to, and there are no good reasons why you say Dubai needs it, but they clearly, and Frankfurt, they clearly see a business opportunity here. And Schiphol actually ring up Heathrow, don't they? And they say, thank you very much, we're so pleased that British
model is all about sucking traffic out of Britain into their hub.
Yeah,
That's right, but why can't we have the hub in Britain? Which is what it was. I mean, Heathrow was, 10 years ago, Heathrow was by far not the #1 international airport.
it's like our ports. We lost our ports through neglect.
Yeah, that's exactly the same.
Yeah, they went to Holland.
Can I just, so, it is a good question, but if you look at Heathrow's, and despite the fact we've got this huge OMB market, if you look at the routes that Heathrow operate out of Heathrow, there are no flights out of none. There are no flights out of Heathrow at all that don't carry transfer passengers. Now, you could argue that there are some with few, and they would still be viable even if they didn't have. But half the flights out of Heathrow would not be viable without transfer traffic. Half the flights. So, it isn't that they would then be viable out of Gatwick or Standard. They would not be viable from the UK. So, particularly those long-haul routes, particularly, and you said the world's changing, absolutely right. Those long-haul routes, those emerging economies, I think that, I don't think anyone's saying here that without a hub airport, London wouldn't be connected to New York or Tokyo or to Hong Kong. We wouldn't be as well connected, we wouldn't have so much choice of airlines and so much frequency. But those emerging economies, the brick economies and the ones coming up behind them, we would not have, in order to get to those markets, our businessmen, our tourists, and just importantly, their businessmen would have to fly via Paris, via Dubai, via Frankfurt, and that would have a huge penalty for the UK economy.
Hi, Christy from VA. I just wanted to echo the importance of the hub, really. We operate a hub model at Heathrow with a dominant carrier there. Without that transfer traffic, so many of our routes would not be viable. And the frequencies that you have on 7 routes, which is convenient for those high-value customers that we're trying to suck into the hub.
I'll just say, I think Daniel made the point when he talked about the docks. Shipping the docks was a business where we were world leaders, and at the time we lost that advantage. Aviation, similarly, is an industry in which we are a world leader, and I think what we need to do is to have a debate, which we're having, as to whether we want to be at the top in that industry or not. I mean, if we decide that we don't want to hub, or we don't feel that that's where we should be, then so be it. That's a political decision. That's a decision that we're making as a country. But all I'm saying is that let's have that debate. Let's be open about what the risks are. Now, the difference between Dan and I is we might have a different idea where that hub should be. There is a bigger argument that you've alluded to about whether we should have a hub or not. I personally think
we should have a hub. It's the degree to which the connectivity thing is it's become quite a major argument.
But it's a huge argument.
But VA needs its connectivity.
It's a huge argument, because if you look at where the world economy is going, New York is New York, but the cities in China and the development that you're going to see in these great economies and the emerging over the next 20 or 30 years, that's where the action is in terms of global growth. And I think we should have more connection to these places. And I don't see how we can have that without a hub.
Tim?
Yeah, I mean, to go back to a point that I made when I was in introductory comments, when you look at the forecast, the hub issue is a debate, but it's not the debate. It's not the whole debate. Actually, there is a core of traffic. There's a core of growth here, which is around short haul and it's around leisure. It's not just short haul leisure, but there are combinations of short haul and leisure in that market. Significant growth over the period, over the next 30, 40 years in that market is projected. And you've got to look at the market you're providing for and whether it's right to provide very expensive hub airport capacity to meet that need, or whether actually you design and provide the capacity that's needed to meet that demand. When you're looking at schemes anywhere up to £100 billion down to 20 billion to provide that kind of capacity, or you look down to the costs that we've been talking about, which are anywhere between £2.5 to £3 to £4 billion for runway at standstill, but providing the same capacity.
You'd like to mention the cost of roads and where to get to it, because you can put this in a comparative context. Slapping a load of tarmac down doesn't cost a lot of money. No.
David?
You cannot have a £3 billion scheme for a second runway at standstill. That's just misleading.
One of the things we've suffered from, as an investor, on behalf of teachers, one of the biggest investors that's found out their pension plans investing and would like to invest more in the UK, there is a lack of political leadership. Your own party, the Labour Party, the Lib Dems,
Sure.
They couldn't argue themselves out of paper bag. There's no leadership whatsoever. They are deferring the debate to another commission. So, I'd be fascinated to hear when you go back to your party and you chat to whoever it is or the tribal selectors that you're on. There's no leadership.
I've gone on such a limb on this. My own constituency, I've said I wanted to expand Heathrow. I was part of a group where we said I'm probably the first MP in history that's recommended a runway, very near through part of my constituency as a sort of think piece. I've gone so far on this.
But why your colleagues on your side or somebody else's side?
That's the political.
But if you look at Amsterdam, why has Amsterdam have done better? One, because the government pretty much own the airport. They pretty much own the airport. And I was at an aviation conference last week, and they basically said all the other airlines are going to subsidise KLM continuing to use Schiphol as a base. What are there, 600,000 people who live in the airport?
That's a good point.
I did talk about Frankfurt extensively in my introductory remarks.
No, you did.
I made exactly the same point.
Exactly the same.
It was the political bit. And frankly, if we decided something on this 5 years ago, we wouldn't be having this debate. People would be complaining, but we would have moved on. And I've said this is an internal debate. This is a theological debate. There's no answer that everyone will agree on until there's actually a decision from government. We will be having the same debate in 20 years if we don't do anything.
Well, and the political landscape we have at the moment won't make it simple. Because Conservatives worry about losing seats. Labour...
Well, that is to prejudge the issue.
Of course.
I mean, there are politicians.
But that's what we're here for.
I think it's a little unfair. I mean, I'm also a member of Kwasi's party, but so I'm not totally disinterested. But I do think when you actually have people like Kwasi who have shown real leadership on this, and Boris who has shown real leadership on this, I don't think you can say that there are politicians who are not willing to put their head above the parapet.
I didn't say that. I didn't use those words. I just said that the parties as a collective can't make it, and the leaders of those parties can't make a decision.
I think that's a good point. Next Kwasi go back to his
I want to go and vote in a party political debate, so it's a rather fitting exit. Thank you very much.
I don't know if anybody else on the panel has any final comments that they want to make. I'm just aware that one of the things that has been made, the points have been made about some of the costs associated and that have been tabled, and if they include full calculated surface transport links. I don't know if there's anything that you want to add on that, Nigel.
No, I think that Daniel and I enjoy debating costs, and we will continue to do so. I think that we've submitted our plans, and those will be scrutinised. I think that what's clear is that there is, and we've been honest about this, that there is some that the airport infrastructure will be paid for by our shareholders. We're clear on that. What is to be debated is the extent to which the surface access contribution will come from the public purse and the private purse. What we've seen on projects like Crossrail, on the Western Rail Access, which is coming in 2021, is that there is a contribution that the airport will make to the infrastructure, but if the wider society benefits, then those costs get picked up by the public purse. But what our submission builds on is Crossrail coming to Heathrow, which will increase the service access capability. We've got upgrades to the D line, which will significantly increase the capacity on that. We've got commitment from the government to Western Rail access, which is the link from Heathrow to Reading, which will significantly increase. So we're confident that we've already, that before you even build the third runway in the mid-2020s, that there will be significant enhancement to the surface access to Heathrow, which is really kind of. But we also, if we were to get permission for the third runway, we would also need to do specific projects, and the key one is the link from Heathrow to Clapham Junction, the southern rail access. So there are costs, but those are in our proposals, and you know, the TfL will come out with their assessment of the costs, and you know, they will argue, we will argue, but that's, you know, going back to my speech, that's why I think it's important that we have this independent commission have been set up. They will hopefully come up with what is the actual truth and you know, the facts rather than myths and accusations.
Anything final comments that either of you would like to make?
I'd like to put this in context briefly of a city which has grown by 2 million people over the last 10 or so years, and which is projected to grow by at least another million in the next 10 years, where there's a major housing crisis. Happily, we have stayed ahead of the transport crisis that accompanies that growth, with the upgrades of the tube and the Piccadilly line upgrade, which is not yet funded and which will increase capacity by 60%, absolutely has to happen. It absolutely has to happen simply to accommodate London's growth. It is not being planned in such a way that it would accommodate an increase of 50% or doubling of passenger numbers at Heathrow. So I just think we mustn't bank some of the things that are being proposed anyway and say that will serve the airport, because there are other reasons for it. And then when you look at the site at Heathrow, within the perimeter it is larger than the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, where I am councillor. It has 4 tube stations, if you count Hampton Cross, which is virtually off the site. It has 4 tube stations, a 15-minute connection to Paddington, Crossrail on its way, as Nigel pointed out, and the rail link to Reading on its way, as Nigel pointed out. It is capable of supporting, like Kensington and Chelsea, those densities, homes for 180 to 200,000 people, and jobs for a minimum of 30 to 40,000 people, and possibly 60 or 70,000. That is, in a civilized city, the future of Heathrow as a place. The future of Heathrow as a company should be running our brand new airport somewhere else. And that would be a rebalancing of the city of London that would actually bring benefits to everybody, including Heathrow if they seize the opportunity.
And on that note, I think the clock is ticking, not least in terms of now, but in terms of the next few days and weeks ahead before we see the proposals coming through the Daily Commission. I think we've realised tonight the strength of the issues and the complexity of some of the issues that the Daily Commission will have to deal with. Obviously, something will be off the table, some core principles that we're debating, I'm sure they are dealing with. But certainly, I guess over the next few years, next couple of years, you will see far more debate and dialogue involving the public, involving those options that are still on the table, importantly that then politicians will need to wrestle with after the 2015 election. So thank you very much to our panel for the contribution that you've made to use it from the floor. And please do stay for a while and have a drink and talk further about some issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much.